Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod here to go over MSU's next Big Ten game in Evanston against the Northwestern Wildcats. Big thank you to all who support the show through one-time gifts on PayPal or Venmo, and those of you on a recurring basis through Patreon or Substack. Specifically, those on Patreon, at the Mateen Cleaves level, Bill Church, Brian O'Donnell, Michael Bosnick, Chad Hickey, Mike Huntoon, and Draymond Green supporters, Adam Walzak, Dan Rankin, James Benton, Jim L., David Brame, Paul Marsh, Scott Driscoll, Doug Robinson, Dan O'Dranak, and Joe Hollis. And all of you on the Scott Skiles supporters, as well as Rich Wagenheim and Kenneth Cremett on Substack. So far, MSU hasn't struggled a whole lot in Big Ten play, but things are always different on the road. And a place that used to be a fairly friendly confines in Evanston has now become a little less so for the Spartans and actually for a lot of teams. Certainly since Chris Collins has taken over in the last few years. His team has less expectations this year without Boo Buie, but I think we've come to expect a tough game when it comes to Northwestern. They sort of have had Michigan State's number the last few years, at least the last four or so. And as for those of you watching YouTube, obviously, I'm recording remote, no longer in Grand Rapids, as you can see from the palm trees behind me, and I don't expect any sympathy, so I'm not going to ask for any. So let's talk about the Wildcats a little bit. What's interesting is because we were a few years away from declaring Chris Collins dead man walking, and
Yeah.
then he makes the tournament and has had a decent amount of success. And also, when he's gotten to the tournament, he's had some success with a couple first round wins. So,
hmm
which is more than Nebraska can say since they've yet to win a tournament game. It's a noon game on Sunday. Northwestern is 10-5 overall, 1-3 in the Big Ten. They're ranked 53rd in McKenpom. They've had some narrow losses on the road to Iowa by just one, with kind of last second shot by Dix. And they also lost at Penn State and got blown out by Purdue at home. They managed to beat Illinois in overtime at home, which gave them their one win. So on offense, they're 78th overall, which is not very good. Which puts them at 15th in the league, so pretty poor. But they just don't shoot very well. 32% from three, which I guess better than Michigan State, puts them at 201st, but 194th from two. So they don't shoot well either. And they're 162 on free throw percentage, which is unusual. In the past they've been really good, but I think that was likely because of Boo Buie, who is so good at the line. He got a lot of fouls before. Offensive rebounding has not been very good. They're 143rd there. They don't turn the ball over not much, so that helps them quite a bit. So they're only 19th in turnover percentage. So that is one bright spot for them on offense.
That's the only reason why they're even as high as number 78 offensively. I think the bottom line is this Northwestern team, and none of the teams that Chris Collins has had have been great offensively, but this one is really limited. I mean, you see the shooting numbers; they are what they are. They don't get second chances. They don't even convert particularly well. They're very mediocre when it comes to the free throw line. So, and they don't get there a ton. So the only reason they're even functional is that they don't shoot themselves in the foot. They don't commit turnovers. And that's also been more or less a staple of the Collins era. We'll talk about it more when we get into the individual players, but this is a really top heavy team. I mean, you almost could not draw up more of a polar opposite from Michigan State. It was something they really were drilling on in the broadcast last night against Washington. We're recording this on Friday afternoon. MSU only has one double-digit score, but they go so deep that anybody could hurt you on any given night.
Right.
Northwestern is the furthest thing away from that. They've got three double-digit scorers. Two of them in particular are at 19 plus per game, but then it just falls off a cliff. And so that plus the lack of a real point guard, you mentioned Boo Buie a couple times already. He gave Northwestern that. He gave them because he developed over the course of his time there from a guy who came in mostly as just a shooter with questionable shot selection to a guy who actually was a truly good point guard. He was still a scorer, but he created for teammates. He ran that offense well. He became a very solid all-around point guard. They don't have anything close to that this year. And in fact, they run most of their offense through Brooks Barnheiser, who plays either the 3 or the 4, depending upon who else is out there with him. So it's a very unusual looking team in that way. And though he's a very talented player, I think the fact that they have to do that and they run so much offense through their forwards is part of that's a symptom of the problem rather than a solution, rather than
Right.
something to be
Exactly.
lauding them for.
Right.
So I think that plays into all of this. They just don't have the kind of guard play that you would need to have a better offense.
Well, we saw that last night with Washington. That Great
Absolutely.
Osibor was their main playmaker, and if you can kind of
Absolutely.
frustrate him, or you don't bring a lot of doubles, which Michigan State didn't, or very briefly, if anything. They didn't
It's
have open people to throw to, and then then there are all sorts of problems.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to remember, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a year somewhere along the line, but this is a year where it just seems to me anecdotally we've got more Big Ten teams than ever that just don't have really functional point guards, and so they're having to kind of manufacture playmaking. Michigan does it certainly better than Washington or Northwestern, but it's still, to me, it's an issue when they get into the heavyweight portion of their schedule. The fact that they have to run so much offense through a 7-foot forward,
Yeah.
and he's been good in some ways, but he also makes a lot of mistakes. And I think when in some of their late game situations, it's shown up. USC does not really have a legitimate point guard, and they've got one of the ugliest looking offenses I've ever seen in my life. So I mean, we've just named 4 teams in the league without even trying
Yeah.
that don't, there may be more. I'd have to think about it, but it strikes me as unusual to say the least, but Northwestern is another example of that.
Yeah. Well, for as bad as they are on offense, defensively they're much better, and so they're ranked 27th overall on defense. Uh, but they're not really good defending the threes or the twos, which is weird. They're 155th against the threes, 149th against the twos, and so you kind of ask yourself, well, why? How can you have a good defense? Well, it's because they generate a lot of turnovers. They're 36 in generating turnovers. They're also really good defensive rebounders. So when you miss, you don't get second chances. They're 46th in defensive rebounding. Just in comparison, numbers are still lower than Michigan State's as far as certainly overall defense, 3-2 defense, and rebounding. I don't think Michigan State generates as many turnovers as Northwestern, but
Not even
yeah,
remotely in the
right,
same
exactly. So
universe. Yeah.
so that's the one difference in their defenses, I suppose, from a ranking standpoint. And then finally, just as usually is the case with Northwestern, from a pace standpoint, they're slow. They are 300th in pace of play and tempo, 242nd average length of offensive possession. And so they definitely slow people down a little bit on defense, but it's largely from their offense running so slowly.
Well, that's how they're going to keep this a slow paced game. Yes, they will be more deliberate when they have the ball, but their defense is what really slows opposing teams down. And frankly, though I'd love to believe otherwise, I think it will have an effect in slowing down Michigan State. This is again very much a different story than what Michigan State saw in its last game.
Yeah.
But both teams wear purple as their primary color, but otherwise, not a lot of differences on the court. Uh, Danny Sprinkle, it was his first time seeing Michigan State. It was the first time for almost all of his players seeing Michigan State. Whereas Northwestern, hey, some of these guys, it's their first time, but I'm looking at their starting lineup. 4 of these guys have seen Michigan State multiple times in their
Yeah.
career. It's less true of their bench, only a couple guys there, but still much. Chris Collins knows Michigan State like the back of his hand. So they're not going to fall victim to the same kind of things that Washington did, where you're not used to seeing what that transition game looks like until you're actually faced with it. Well, Northwestern knows what that's about, so their floor balance is likely going to be very strong. I think in terms of their defense, yeah, it's an not unheard of kind of defense stylistically for the Big Ten, but a little bit unusual. Most of the good defensive teams in the Big Ten, and that not even just this year, I mean, just this is traditionally, are teams that in one way or another, they might not be stylistically exactly like Michigan State, but functionally they're that way, at least in an overarching sense, meaning they're relying on forcing you to take shots you don't want to take, limiting you to one shot, and that's kind of what they do. They're not ball hawking defenses. There's a lot of gambling, etc. Northwestern is a ball hawking defense. They'll throw a lot of traps at you. They're very aggressive in the passing lanes, and yet they don't get. It's not like Brad Underwood's system when he first got to Illinois, where it's a turnover or a dunk. It's not quite that bad, but I do think that has something to do with why their field goal percentage against numbers are very mediocre. I think that's a result in part, to some extent, of how aggressively they hunt turnovers.
Sure.
They do give up some stuff. When they're actually just set in a half court defense, they're pretty good, and they're not going to be easy to break down. They're not going to be easy to get consistently great looks against. Now, Michigan State may be able to do that anyway, but it will represent a job well done if they do pull it off, because this is a good defensive team. They just go about it a little bit differently than most other conference schools do that play good defense.
All right, well, let's talk about the Northwestern and their players in the lineup. Brought to you by the brothers at Just Two Gutters. So I'm sitting out here where it is actually very nice here in Florida, just for one more day until I return to the tundra up north. And they got plenty of gutters here, and we've got gutters back home. And I know you need those because you need the water to stay away from your house. Make sure you have the right people taking care of them. Make sure you clean them out, because if they get all full of gunk, leaves, whatever, you need somebody to clean them out. And the Brothers Just Two Gutters can do that. They'll even come out in this sort of weather, and I guess they put gloves on or something and put their hands in those cold gutters. They'll clean it out. They'll also put leaf guards on. They'll repair things, replace them, whatever you need done as far as gutter work, not only for your house, but for your business, maybe for your for some other building you've got. They can take care of it. You get 10% off as a listener to this show by just saying Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find ways to get estimates at our support page at the Final Fours on the schedule.com/support. You can get either hold of Kurt on the west side of the state or Greg on the east side of the state. They got you covered if you're in Michigan. And so talk to the brothers who Just Two Gutters, and they sponsor a player to keep in the gutter. And we'll talk about that as soon as we get through all the players here. And the fact that Northwestern is a top heavy team, we'll just probably stop after we do the starters, because I'm sure we'll find our player here. So we'll begin with Jalen Leach, 6'4", fifth-year transfer from Fairfield, where he was an all-MAA MAC last season. He's averaging 13.5 points a game, 43, 36, 86 shooting. Second on the team assists with 35 in 15 games, but he's also tends to turn the ball over. He's had 28 turnovers in those 35 assists. And he has a lot of steals, which, as we talked about, they force a lot of turnovers with their aggressive defense, which is a little interesting because, they were very aggressive with Chase Audige when he was with the team a few years ago. And Boo Buie, those guys that was sort of like the first time we saw them ball hawking. And it's interesting that they've kind of sort of kept that strategy going forward.
Yeah, well, it's worked for them. I mean,
I guess that's a good reason to do it.
Right? It's gotten them to 2 straight NCAA tournaments, so why not? Leach has been, I talk about this being a top-heavy team, and really I'm talking about it being a two-man team, but that's not entirely fair to Leach. He's having a pretty good year. 13.5 points. He's probably the closest thing to a legit 3-point threat, 36% on, relatively decent volume.
Yeah.
And he's been effective for them defensively. What he's not is he's not really much of a point guard. As I said earlier, that's really where I think this team, I think they had hoped that either Leach would be more of that, or that another guy we'll mention in a bit, freshman KJ Wyndham, would be a little more ready to just kind of seize that role. And neither of those things happened. So it's left Chris Collins having to improvise with what he does offensively. And you're going to see it when you watch this game. Their half-court sets, it's not going to look like what you're used to seeing in terms of how they run their offense, because they really do largely go through their forwards. But Leach is he's definitely the third best offensive player. There's no question about that.
Yeah, which is a little surprising because the next player we're going to talk about is Ty Berry, 6'3", fifth-year senior. Has had a lot of injury problems last year, and even the end of the year before when he missed the NCAA tournament. He's averaging 7.3 points a game on 34, 38, 65 shooting. Also has 21 steals in the season. But he was a guy that towards the end of the season before he got hurt 2 years ago, it really looked he was really coming on. He was shooting, I don't know, he just felt like it was about 50% from three. And he was a real threat, especially with Audige and Bowie out there. And just you haven't seen the same player since.
I think it's the single biggest reason why Northwestern is not surprising to the upside so far.
Right,
You
right.
know, they haven't a terrible season, but they're not surprising to the upside. Ty Berry has gone from, as a junior, was third year. He had improved steadily as a scorer. He went from, as a freshman, 5.1 points a game, 7.4, 8.5. Last year, before he got hurt late in the season, 11.6 points per game. So he had really, the next logical step as a fifth year player would have been, okay, this is a guy, maybe 14 points a night, something like that. Instead,
Yeah.
he's back down to 7.3. Now, why is that happening? Well, he's playing a little less. He's playing about 4 minutes less per game than he was either of the last 2 years, honestly. So his minutes have gone down a little bit. The field goal shooting, especially from two, has gone way down. But you're right. I mean, last year he was shooting 43% from three. This year, 38. He's still okay, but he's also taking one less attempt per game. He's taking two fewer attempts per game overall from the floor. So he's not he's not getting as many shots as he did. Never mind actually stepping it up. And I think that's a big reason why Northwestern is, kind of, they're not out of anything. They're still very much in a position that if they get it together, they could still be an NCAA tournament team. But it's why you wouldn't put them in there today,
Yeah.
is
Right.
because Ty Berry was the guy that you thought, all right, if you knew Martinelli and Barnheiser were going to be good. If Berry can get in there, that gives them a third. And that hasn't happened. Leach has kind of been a third, but I just expected more out of Ty Berry. I honestly don't know if it's a function of lingering effects from missing that time with his leg injury. That's entirely possible.
Sure.
But whatever the motivation is, whatever the reason is, the facts are he's not producing the way I think they need him to produce if they're going to be really good.
Yeah, we had expected more from, well, I would say with Jeremy Fears, that leg injury, I think even though he's 100% or whatever at the beginning of the season, I think
Yeah.
he's playing better now and he looks more comfortable. Now, maybe that's just an element of just sort of playing enough. But I think those leg injuries, I mean, especially for basketball, it's hugely important, right? And so it
And,
can
and
affect you in subtle ways that you can't really even detect in some way, you know?
absolutely. Well, the thing that Tom Izzo has talked about in regard to fears, and maybe that's operative with Barry too. I don't know. Is that he said that it's one thing to be 100%, and it's another thing. And I'm paraphrasing, and it's another thing to play like you're 100%, to trust
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And I think with Jeremy, I think we've seen it's taken a while. I think he's been really good all year long, but he's clearly, because of the things he does, that mean so much to his team. But there's no question that he is looking more confident offensively of late, particularly with regard to his own offense.
Yeah.
He's more aggressive there. And I think it is just a function of increased confidence that, hey, my leg is sound. It's not gonna snap in half when I land
Yeah.
after I've jumped. Those things that you could tell yourself, well, you know more than I as a physician, but I think there's a difference, you know, what you know to be true logically and what still kind of haunts you emotionally about
Yeah.
something. And I think that can be a hard thing to get past. Maybe that's what's going on with Barry. We don't know.
Yeah, well, I remember talking to my friend, who's a colleague, Dr. Hamilton, who's an orthopedic sports surgeon, and he was saying he's had a player who was a football player, and he got a similar gunshot, not similar gunshot wound, but he got a gunshot wound, head injury, recovered fully from it, but never could recover from it psychologically. You know, like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
just had never, he was never, not that he thought he was going to get, shot out in the field or something, but sometimes those things can really affect you in ways you can't imagine. And then certainly with just just an injury like an ACL, which they oftentimes just happen, especially in basketball, what seems like seemingly randomly, like, just running
Yeah.
down the court or land, just jumping like you do a million times,
Yep.
to trust that again, to that you've got 100%, use of it, not to, it's got to be a psychological factor or two, with that. So
Absolutely. And I think that's something, um, that I wonder about. I tend to think he'll get past it, but you take it to football, somebody like Aiden Hutchinson with that broken leg. When we're not at a point yet where we're even beginning to see what that's like. But yeah, you wonder. Hey, all the physical news on that seems to be as good as possible. They said there was no nerve damage, all the stuff you'd worry
yeah,
about. But psychologically, are you able to cut loose the way you used to? It's
yeah,
I think that's probably a very, very much an individual by individual kind of thing.
I think there's no question about that. So moving on to Brooks Barnhart, we mentioned a number of times, his 6'6" senior, averaging 19.3 points a game, 9.5 rebounds a game, leads the team in assists with 49 in 11 games, steals with 28, second in blocks with about a little more than one a game, shooting 44, 33, and 83. He was a little better shooter, I think, from deep last year,
He
and so that's
was.
been down a little bit. But he's a guy who I feel like it was the Michigan State game when they played a couple years ago. That's where he sort of, you felt like he just kind of turned a corner and he started getting, that was sort of the hockey stick moment for him. But maybe I'm misremembering, but I feel like that's the game.
He's gotten better every year he's been there. And
Yeah,
boy, there's probably no greater testament to a player than to be able to say that, hey, every year in the program, he's been better. And so he went from, 2 years ago on that team with Bowie and Audige, that group, and say, well, he was kind of an X factor.
yeah,
He was
right.
the guy that was becoming like, okay, he's the third guy.
Hmm.
To last year, really just flat out, really good player. He was the number 2 guy to Bowie on that team. And now, look, you're not hearing any talk about him. Like, he just doesn't get a lot of discussion because Northwestern isn't a glamour team to begin with, and they're not off to the kind of start that would get people talking about him. But you
Exactly.
look at what he's doing. He is killing it for this team in every area. Second leading scorer by a tenth of a point. Leading rebounder, leader in assists. I mean, he's averaging like 4.5 assists per game as a forward. He leads them in steals. He's up over, it's up well over 2.5 a game. He's second on the team in blocks. He's averaging one of those a game. Like, there's no part of Northwestern's operation that he's not touching. And you are going to see in this game on Sunday, they are going to run offense through him frequently. He is their catalyst. And it's going to look unusual. It might remind you a little bit of Penn State a couple years ago with Pickett, where the Brad Underwood famously coined the phrase "booty ball."
Yeah, right.
Because that's what it is. I mean, Barnhizer frequently, their sets are they get the ball to Barnhizer on the wing, and then he starts backing down his defender, starting probably about 18 feet or so from the basket, and puts him on his back and just kind of works him down into position where he can either make a play for himself or make a play from someone else. But it's probably the best option Northwestern feels that they have. But he's having just a great year. He's a competitor. He's a tough kid. He's always been that. Always played hard. And look, he's going to create problems. I mean, in the starting lineup, at least, Michigan State with their normal starting lineup does not have a good matchup for him because, as best as when I think about it, it's probably Jaden Akins guarding
Yeah.
him, and he's a little bit big for Jaden.
Yeah.
So it will not surprise me. People have talked about Frankie Fiddler kind of his minutes slipping pretty significantly from where they were earlier in the year. This is a game that I could potentially see a lot of Frankie Fiddler, a lot of Cohen Carr,
I was going to say
because
you might even see Carr start over Tallman in this sort of game, just speak from
I don't
situationally from a. I don't know.
I don't think they'll change the starting lineup, but I think you will see when you add up the minutes at the end of the
Yeah, right.
game, I think
Exactly.
it will look different
Yeah.
because I just don't think and Barnheiser's going to play a ton. Like barring foul trouble, he's going to be out there almost all the time.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to deal with him. Now sometimes he might be playing the 4. So then it's a little bit different. But when he's playing the 3, that's a matchup you've got to contend with. And the good news is, and Tom Izzo made this comment in his post game last night, not about this matchup specifically, but just generally, that one of the really good things about this Michigan State team is they've got the ability to play a lot of different ways and match up with a lot of different kinds of styles and players. And that is true. They've actually got 2 legitimate options that they could put on Barnhiser, who at least physically can be good matches for him. And honestly, the way Cohen Carr has been playing defense, I think it's one of the better kinds of matchups you could have. Period. I Barnhiser's still going to get his, but you know what I'm saying. Like
Yeah.
Cohen Carr has a chance to slow him down a little bit. And I think Frankie's been okay too. I think he's been better than I thought he'd be defensively, to be honest. So they've got some cards they can play, which is a good thing. But I think at the start, it's going to be difficult. I think for large stretches of this game, it could be difficult for Michigan State to go with the 3 guard lineups they've tended to rely on a lot this season. The exception to that would be if those lineups actually tend to work in such a way that they force Barnhiser to take some fouls, which would be
Right.
nice.
I mean, there's always the opposite side of that. Is if it gives you more of a defensive advantage than your defensive deficiency,
Yeah.
then it's, obviously to your benefit to do it. And you won't know until you play and to kind of see what happens, I
He's
suppose.
just my bias here is that Barnhiser is a 5th-year guy. He's a smart player.
Yeah, yeah,
I'd be surprised if he takes some dumb fouls, but you never know.
yeah. All right, so moving on to Nick Martinelli, 6'7" junior. He's become even again, this very similar to Barnhiser at the end of last year. He really started emerging, and then this year he's the leading scorer on the team, as you mentioned, by 0.1 points. So he's averaging almost 20 points. So 19.4 points a game. Second in rebounding at 5 points, 7 rebounds a game, shooting 51, 43, and 69. Over 5 free throw attempts per game as well. Aside from having really bad posture, he's turned into a really good player.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not patting myself on the back for this. I think it was fairly obvious to see coming, but I remember talking about him. I think when Michigan State played that game in Evanston last December and got hammered. And I had said at the time, because I know I thought this is the next guy.
Yeah,
Like
right.
the path of his progression as a player is so much like Barnhiser, and it really has happened. He's not quite as good a playmaker as Barnhiser, but they will use him to do some of that too. You will see Martinelli booty ball in it. But he's just, the 43% from 3. He's really dialed in his jumper. Good rebounder, maybe not a great one yet, but good. And he's just got a scorer's knack. Like he finds himself, offensive putbacks, or he makes himself available for a pass down low, or he can step out and hit the 3. He gets to the line decently at a decent rate. Tough cover, tough player, good player. He and Barnhiser, man, that's if they had Boo Buie back for his 19th year this season, this would be a really tough team to deal with because that's what they're missing.
Yeah.
Like these two, you can't argue with what Barnhiser and Martinelli are doing, but they are missing that third guy. You're like, oh God, and we got to worry about him too. Like
Yeah.
Leach has been the scoring numbers look kind of like that, but I don't think he plays. I don't think he functions like that.
Yeah, and with Barnhiser, the way he plays, I mean, he leads the team in assists. So he's obviously a guy who, if you risk doubling or trying to sort of force the issue, he's going to find someone who's open. He's shows himself very competent there, and then certainly playing off Martinelli, they're both sort of the same kind of player, right? 6'6", 6'7".
Very much.
And so you're inclined to probably sag off of Martinelli or something, and then he's going to hurt you from deep. And so it makes sense that they sort of work in tandem in some ways in being so effective scoring.
The thing that also makes it difficult, and fortunately, Michigan State isn't a team that's heavily reliant on doubling. But if you were to try to do that to either of those guys, what makes them different than say a five man where you more conventionally you see those kind of players receiving doubles is that they can both handle the ball.
Right.
So it's not only, oh, can they pass out of it? They can actually beat you with the dribble out of those situations at times too, or at least put themselves in better position to then make the pass. I mean, it's hard.
And finally, we'll finish with Clarkson native Matt Nicholson, 7 foot, 250 pound. What is he like? He's got to be his COVID senior year at this point, I
It
think.
is. It is.
Averaging 5 points a game, 4.9 rebounds a game, leads the team with blocks at 19, so a little over one a game, shooting 60% from the floor, paltry 48% from line. And he is not dynamic, but he's a tough guy who is. We weren't sure a couple years ago if he was going to be emerged as the starting center, but he's definitely secured that and been very good.
He's really, I think he's a key to that team defensively because one of the reasons that they're not Illinois from the early Underwood tenure is they've got him as a backstop.
Yeah,
If they on the perimeter, if they want to take a little more of a risk in a given moment, they know they've got that guy back there to defend the rim and at least give them a chance. Uh, he's, I think he's definitely panned out to somewhere near the top level of his potential. When I saw him in high school, and I had a hope that maybe he would be a guy who would just kind of last and Michigan State could add him in the spring of that year. It didn't work out. He got the
yeah,
offer from Northwestern and he took it. But he put on a lot of good weight over his time there. He's gotten a lot bigger because he was not built like he is now when he was at Clarkston. He was thin. And he never had real offensive game, and he still doesn't. But his value is, as we say, as a defender, as a guy who just kind of occupies space, decent screener, and he can rebound a little bit. But I think it's mostly on the defensive end that he has value for them. And they don't try to get 30 minutes a night out of him. They share that
right.
position has been shared for most of his career. So I think all in all, they get good production out of him for what they need.
All right, so I think if I would be able to guess, but who would you say is the player to keep in the gutter brought to you by the Brothers Suggested Gutters?
Very tough call because you've got two guys who are essentially scoring the same amount of points. But I'm going to go with Barnhizer because he makes a little better impact overall. He's a better
Right.
rebounder, better playmaker, better, more impactful, at least defensive player. So I'm going to go with Barnhizer.
Don't need much of a crystal ball to know who will be next year. Although, with the way things work as far as rosters, maybe he won't be there next year. Who knows? Moving on to reserves, then we've got Angelo Charvino, a 6'6" freshman, playing about 10 minutes a game. Got in 20 against Purdue in that blowout, but he's averaging 4.5 points a game, 1.7 rebounds a game, shooting 59, 47, and 50.
Yeah, he's the next guy in that Chris Collins assembly line, and he's starting to show a little more as the season is going on. He wasn't playing a lot early, but as you said, 20 minutes in their last game against Purdue. I don't know that I'll expect him to play 20 minutes in this one because I expect it to be more competitive than that game was. But uh, yeah, I mean the shooting numbers are still relatively low volume, but you can't argue with the efficiency. He seems to be another of these multi-talented forwards that, next year I would, as you say, the portal, you never know, but you would expect that he will probably slot in where Barnhizer is, and it'll be he and Martinelli as the forward combination. But for now, he's a guy that I think they're excited about because he's continuing to progress and show more as the season's going on.
Then we have KJ Wyndham. He's, I guess as you describe, is probably the best point guard on the team, but he's a freshman, 6'3", from Indianapolis, averaging 3.5 points a game with a 3-to-1 assist to turnover ratio, which is very good, shooting 33, 18, and 75. So obviously he's got to work on his shooting, but he does play quite a bit. He Averages about 16 minutes a game.
Yeah, and it's mostly because of the fact that he can actually maybe take a little bit of the burden off Barnheiser the
Sure.
minutes that he's out there. But they had hopes, I think, that maybe he would emerge as a guy who could be a 25-minute a night guy. That hasn't happened, and in part it's because of the shooting. It's just tough to play a guy that amount of minutes if he's not being a little more productive as an offensive threat himself. But I think in terms of long-term potential, he's a guy that they definitely are expecting big things from as time goes on. And 16 minutes a game, he's definitely playing a role on this team, just not much as a scorer.
Right. So next would be the backup center, Luke Hunger, 6'10", 240 pounds, sophomore, averaging 3.6 points a game, 3.1 rebounds a game, plays about 16 minutes, shooting 38, 7, and 83. So he's definitely got a little working on his shooting to get up there at some point.
Yeah, and I'm just checking something because I have a memory of his performance last year, and I want to see if I've got this right. Just bear with me a second. No, I guess I had a memory of him actually torching Michigan State from three, which did not happen. He was 0 for 1, but he was 5 for 5 in that game on twos.
That may be
So
what
he
you're thinking of,
really,
yeah.
it is what I'm thinking of. He
Yeah.
did damage. He just didn't do what I was going to say is and this is still true. They think he can be a stretch threat. It just hasn't happened yet. That
Right.
7%, not great, but it's also not on heavy volume. I think in general, there's a lot more offense there for them to unlock. I think he was pretty inarguably better last year offensively when he played for them than he's been this year so far. But solid player, a tag team partner with Nicholson, and a guy that over the last 2 years of his career, so many stays in Evanston, he'll at the very least be the top guy in a tandem there. I think that's his next state of evolution is to be the main guy.
Right. And finally, to round out the players we expect to see the court, Justin Mullins, 6'6" junior, averaging 3.8 points a game, 3.6 rebounds a game, shooting 49, 17, and 73. Plays about 20 minutes. So obviously 17 is what limits him more time on the court.
Yeah, and another guy with 21 steals, so kind of a
who
bit
doesn't
of a
on their team.
poor man's. Yeah, three guys, and none of them are the leader. Barnheiser's the leader with 28. Kind of a poor man's Chase Audige. Chase Audige without the streaky 3-point shooting. But still a valuable piece, to be able to play those kind of minutes off their bench. It gives them some depth and some options there.
All right, so who cleans the glass best? Brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, who cleaned your glass best. So if you have windows that need to be cleaned, even in this weather, although I don't know if they go out in this weather, maybe they have to wait a little bit. They can certainly do the interior house, windows, the screens, windowsills, whatever it might be. You get 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate, which you can find at our support page. The Final Four is on theschedule.com/support. They will come out and do whatever needs to be done. They can power wash your house as well. They do interior painting during the winter. So maybe it's not a time to get your windows cleaned, but maybe it's a good time to get a room or two touched up and painted. Maybe you just don't like that color. You make the mistake like I did when we had our son, and I went to the store and I got, we wanted to get a neutral color because we didn't know if it was a boy or girl. And so I got green called Friendly Frog. And it was when the sun came through the window, the carpet in the hallway would glow green. It was like such a bright, you get those color swatches, you just don't know what they're going to be. So do we eventually repaint that room. So I wish I'd had the Squeegee Squad do it for me. That's what I'm saying. So if you wanted to take care of something like that,
would you have expected the Squeegee Squad to save you from your color choice, though?
I don't think so, but I think they certainly would have. They would have been able to fix my mistake. We had another
That's
year.
True.
We had paint, and again, painted the house, and it turned out our house. It wasn't orange, but it was kind of like an orangish sort of brown or something. My wife hated it. I mean, for years she's like, "We got to repaint the house." I'm like, "Yeah, we just painted 2 years ago. It's expensive to paint a house." So
Yeah.
eventually we succumbed, and now she's very happy because now her house is no longer orange, yellow, kind of whatever it was. Because
Wow.
again, those paints just never look right. Anyway, so you need that done. Contact the Squeegee Squad Grand Rapids. They can obviously clean the windows, whether it's your house or your business, maybe a high rise, or have an apartment complex or something like that. They even clean the windows in the state capitol. So they've got a pretty large region in the Grand Rapids area. So they sponsor Cleans the Glass Best. Right now, I'm ahead. I'm 6-5. You came back. I was on a 2-0 run, and you cut that in
I
half.
think it's 3-0
Oh,
because
I
I
think
was
you're
up
right.
for a
You were up.
while.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You were up 3 to. Yeah, yeah. You're
I
probably
was
up
up
4-3.
4-3. Yeah.
Yeah, and I got 3 in a row. So yeah. Well, anyway, so I got to turn things around here, make sure I stay ahead of you here. So we're still going to use just because I think the snake draft is probably working best. I'll start with Kohler. I think you're crazy not to take Kohler, so he's sort of the obvious first
Sure.
choice for me. Who are you taking for your the 2 and 3 picks?
I'm going big in this game. I think that's the kind of game it's going to be. So I'll go with Zapala and Coop.
Okay. Yeah, and the one thing is Zapala has not really had a lot of rebounds the last few games, so I don't know who I again I think I'm gonna stick with Carr. I think just he seems like the certainly as he's always got about 5 a game. It seems like at this point, the last few games. So, and I do think he'll get a lot of time on the floor because of the difficult
Could
matchup with
be.
Martinelli and Barnheiser.
Could be.
So he'll see the floor quite a bit. Although with a slow pace, I can definitely see how you may get a Zapala Cooper. They might actually have a pretty good tandem at the
That and
glass.
just kind of the nature of the game.
Yeah,
Northwestern's
slow pace.
physical.
Yeah,
Northwestern's physical. They do have some size, but that's my thinking. But it's not. Yeah, nothing's a lock with this stuff. So
that's for sure. As we've discovered, aside from Kohler having about between 5 to 10,
that
that's pretty much the only
that's a
lock.
that's a lock. Yeah.
All right, moving on to the keys of the game. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see I've got I'll just get my microphone out of the way. My logoed Final Fours on the schedule. Quarter zip, super comfortable, great for like golfing or just around town. So you can get that at Nudge Printing, obviously not with a logo. Unfortunately, our logo is too small, and so they couldn't embroider it, but they actually do this embroidered options too if you want. And so nice about Nudge is not only you have the massive selection of Michigan State gear and other schools, which you can find at nudgeprinting.com, but you can go to fabricatedcustoms.com, and there they can make whatever you need. So if you've got a show or you've got a business or you've got a vacation doing something, you want to have a fundraiser, they can do all these things. They can design them for you. They can hook it up so you can kind of pick whatever you want. So maybe 3 people want t-shirts, 2 people want a hoodie, and someone wants a hat. They can do all those things, and it's not a big deal if they just do. They don't have to do large quantities. You don't have to like order 50 shirts in order to get these discounts. They'll help you with the pricing. They'll do all the work for you, and so I can't recommend enough. We did it for a robotics fundraiser for the high school. It was so easy because everybody sent the money to them. They shipped it to their house. I did nothing. I just said, "Hey, we want this. This is what the logo kind of looks like." And he's like, "Hey, Gabe did it himself." He's like, "Do you like this?" We're like, "Perfect." And so everyone loved the shirts, and they're high quality, screen printed, and they're all made in Michigan. So, again, check it out, nudgeprinting.com or fabricatedcustoms.com, which I think that you can find the link at Nudge Printing. So anyway, 5 keys to the game. The first key is Evanston. So Michigan State was, as I mentioned, they were pretty successful for many years in Evanston, and recently Northwestern smartly started encouraging their students to show up or something. They changed the design of the arena as well a little bit, and it's much noisier and it's a better home court advantage. And Michigan State's lost 2 of the last 3 there, and their struggles against Northwestern. So, can they overcome that? Right?
Yeah. They did. God, what season was it? It was 17-18. They were redoing Welsh Ryan.
Yeah. Where do they play? I can't remember.
They played at
It was on
God,
campus,
was
though, I
it
still
the
think, wasn't it?
no. It was no, it was way out actually. It
It
was
wasn't like the United
was
Center.
it
It
the
was the.
Rosemont? No, but it was
Oh,
like
there. Yeah, yeah,
was it
yeah.
the
Rosemont.
Rosemont Horizon
That
maybe?
sounds right. Yep.
Um and that was the site of, you remember, one of the most dramatic Michigan State comebacks I've ever seen, where they were
Right.
down, God, they were down like, I don't know, 25, maybe even more,
Yeah.
and came storming back in the second half and won it.
And won easily too. They won by like 10.
Yeah,
Like
it was
that.
such a
huge
bizarre
swing.
game,
Yeah.
a bizarre game. And that was a pretty good Northwestern team. That was a team that had a lot of veterans that were coming back from their first ever NCAA tournament team. But anyway, since then, and then so 18-19 was their first year in the redone Welsh Ryan. Since then, it is a better atmosphere. And I think that some of it is probably a renewed marketing effort to students, but I also think part of it is probably attributable to the fact that Northwestern's been a much better program.
Yeah, right. It makes a difference.
Right? It's a lot easier to get people to come out to the game if they're seeing something that's at least winning. I wouldn't exactly describe Northwestern's style of play as incredibly entertaining all the time. Although the turnover creation stuff keeps it lively, but they're not a particularly exciting team typically to watch. But so what? If you win, that will bring people out. And you're right.
Yeah.
That has changed the atmosphere because for forever, that was a place where Michigan State alums, Chicago alums would come in for that game, and it would be at least half, if not more, Michigan State fans. And that was true of several other schools around the conference too, because obviously Chicago is a big hub for Big Ten graduates.
Sure.
Not the case anymore. And I think that combined with the fact that Northwestern just had a better team lately has posed an issue for MSU. So Northwestern's actually won 2 of the last 3 at Welsh Ryan against Michigan State. 14-point game last year, which was not a lot of fun to watch. I can understand why people wouldn't want to recall it, but if you recall, it was not a lot of fun.
Recall the 0, I think.
So,
yeah,
you could say in early returns thus far, Michigan State has handled itself well on the road. They played 2 true road games, won them both relatively comfortably. I mean, Ohio State got dicey for a while, but a 7-point win on the road, you'll take. And obviously, they beat Minnesota by 18. I would say this is the biggest test on the road thus far because I think Northwestern has a better atmosphere than Ohio State does. May not be a better team. That's kind of a close call, but I think the combination of the environment and at the very least, even if they might not be a better team than Ohio State, they're a more mature team, especially in terms of guys having played together for a long time. Leach is new, but the other 4 guys have been with each other for years. So you're facing a team in their environment. And also, this is another thing that 2 more points that probably shouldn't be forgotten. One is Northwestern's had basically a week, will have had basically a week to focus on this. That, you never know for sure how that cuts, but you would think it's an advantage. And then I think the fact is that off to a 1-3 start, they likely feel that their backs are against the wall at least a little bit. And so you would expect that they would come out with a sense of urgency into this one. They don't want to go 1-4. They don't want to take a home loss, all of that. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, they've already lost 1 at home that you don't want to start stacking those up because you got to make them up on the road somewhere. And that's not easy. I mean,
exactly.
They had Iowa and they missed it.
And the other thing to point to is, their 1 conference win did come at home, and it did come against Illinois in overtime. That was impressive. They certainly have. Anybody who's just looking at their record and some of the stats saying, this is a game Michigan State should watch. No, they've proven they can beat a quality team in that building.
Yeah. So the second key to the game is poise. And so, with Northwestern, the way they play defense, ball hawk, is that something Jeremy fears? I don't think he's faced that, right? I don't think he faced that last year. I think he was out. So
he was, no, he played.
Oh, did he play? Okay.
He played.
I couldn't remember.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, that was right. One of the first games they played.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then that miserable 2-game stretch.
Right.
So anyway, so he's seen it once, but Richardson certainly hasn't. And so anyway, be interesting to see how they do against that.
Look, the bottom line is, as we talked about, Northwestern's defense does rely a lot on turnover creation. So they're top 40 in turnover percentage by opponent, but it's not just opponent mistakes. They're also top 40 in steal percentage. So they're forcing a lot of that with the way they play. And that's something that this Michigan State team has got to grapple with. Now, I thought they showed some improvement in that area for the most part against Washington, but this is a different ball game. Stylistically, level of opposition, environment, all of that. MSU's got to be strong with the ball, and that means not just the guards. It even means in the half court, where the bigs are engaging in a handoff,
Yeah.
right? A handoff rub with the guard. They got to make sure they're not sloppy or casual with that. It's like a quarterback sticking that ball in the gut. Got to get it there. You can't just assume it gets there. Northwestern's going to play passing lanes at times, so you got to be smart with those passing decisions and make sure you're really seeing the floor and not missing guys lurking who can then make a play on an errant pass. So everybody's got to be solid. And if it's a heavy turnover game for Michigan State, not only is that taking away their chances to score, but it probably is giving a Northwestern team that is challenged in terms of their shooting some easy scoring opportunities at the other end. And that's something you really don't want to do in a game you expect to be low possession anyway.
Right. Yeah. Every possession's worth a little bit more in a game like this.
Exactly.
Yeah. So third key of the game is second chances. Speaking of second chances, this is a spot where, we don't expect a whole lot from Northwestern, but Michigan State is usually a pretty good offensive rebounding team. Had a struggles. If there's one sort of thing you can take away with the Washington game, they didn't get a whole lot of second opportunities. Now, they didn't really need them. They did fine just with their first opportunities, but this is something that you'd like to see them get something, but Northwestern is a good defensive rebounding team. So which one is going to move on this?
There's a challenge here. And it's a challenge because, Northwestern, we just got done talking about how they create a lot of turnovers. On the other end, they also don't make many themselves. So you would be surprised if Northwestern doesn't have some type of edge in the turnover battle. So that means, all right, you got to make that up. Where are you going to make it up? As you say, Northwestern doesn't do much on its offensive boards, and Michigan State is elite as a defensive rebounding team. So probably not much going on there. But can a very good offensive rebounding Michigan State team get some work done against a good defensive rebounding team? That's the challenge. And you're right. The game against Washington, not nearly as good a defensive rebounding team as Northwestern is. MSU was only okay. They were just a tick maybe above exactly mediocre in that game. And you're right. They didn't need it. And so it's hard to quantify those things. How much did that play into the score, the margin? I mean, play into maybe Michigan State not going full bore after every possible offensive rebound. I don't know. Some of that could have been a little bit affected by the margin. But regardless, for this game, I think Michigan State probably wants to carve out a little bit of an edge here.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of their problems in that game were, it's funny because I watched a number of games and think, well, these teams that shoot a lot of threes, they're long rebounds, and so that gives opportunities for them to get offensive rebounds when they may not be a good offensive rebounding team. Michigan State they were shooting only threes for quite a bit early in that game, and they didn't have any offensive rebounds on all those misses. And so I don't know if they were, if that was sort of hurting their chances of getting the offensive rebounds, because when they have the short shots, those are the ones they tend to get a lot more. They're able to, scoop up and give it second opportunities. So,
it's something, I've talked about a lot less this year because the rebounding job has generally been done so well, but guard rebounding, man, that exact kind of situation is where you hope that guard rebounding is going to show up.
Yeah. All right. So the fourth key of the game is pace. I mentioned before, Northwestern plays very slow, very deliberate. And of course, with the way their defense works, they're going to slow you down getting into your offensive sets because they're just going to harass you trying to get into anything with the ball pressure.
Yeah, Michigan State's got to be really decisive and intentional about what they're doing in the half court, because I don't think they're going to get a ton of transition chances. It'd be great if they did, but I just don't expect it. So then it comes down to, is Northwestern able to really turn this into kind of a turgid, slogging half court game, which is what they want? Or can Michigan State be, as I say, intentional and precise and aggressive in terms of their half court offense, which really means ball movement and man movement is happening. They're getting into their stuff quickly. The ball's moving, and it makes it harder for Northwestern to really limit them the way that they want to. If Michigan State plays into that slower paced kind of atmosphere that Northwestern wants, it might spell trouble.
Yeah. All right. So the fifth and final key of the game is make someone else beat you.
Yeah, I think, as we've talked about, I see this primarily as a two-man team. I mean, Leach has been okay, but I don't think it's a three-man thing. To me, it's not just about Barnhizer and Martinelli scoring, because they're also, as we've talked about, the primary creators. So everything they get kind of flows from those two guys. So as best as is possible, I think Michigan State has got to try to make other people beat them. And historically, good Tom Izzo defensive teams tend to do that. It doesn't mean they shut a leading scorer down completely, but they tend to put that opponent in a position where the main guy isn't able to dominate.
Yeah.
And somebody else has got to step up. We certainly saw that against Washington last night, the job they did on Osabar. This is a tougher job because it's two guys, not one, and they're tougher covers. They'll be tougher to slow down. But I think if they can, when I talk about this, I'm not talking about, well, you got to hold Barnhizer to single digits. That's probably not going to happen. But you want to make them inefficient. And probably the best thing you could do is prevent Barnhizer, especially, from making a lot of plays for others. Like, he'll get his, but make him work for it, make him less efficient than he wants to be, and don't let him turn your attention to him into easy points for another Northwestern player.
Right.
All easier said than done, but
it always is for us, just sitting around and talking about it, for sure. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Michigan State went from 25th on Torvik, and I don't have KenPom, and now they're at 15th. So that kind of matches more what KenPom has. I think you had Michigan State.
Right. I think MSU was 14th.
Yeah. So pretty similar. And they always give projections for records and scores. So now this has Michigan State as a 2.5 point favorite at Northwestern. And that was they had Northwestern projected for most of the year as a winner in this game. So that just flipped, I think, last night. That's just because of Michigan State's offensive and defensive performance. Because now Michigan State's defense is, I mean, they have like top 10 or 14th in Torvik and 28th in offense. So interesting that I imagine that's probably what the point spread will be, about 2.5 points.
Yeah. I can tell you the KenPom margin is Michigan State by 3.
Yeah. So the line's going to be somewhere along there in Vegas if you're a gambling type.
Yeah, and I think that's probably fair.
Yeah, one possession, right?
Based on what I know about these teams, I think that's probably an accurate read. I would expect a competitive, close game. I just think what Northwestern does is kind of in some ways built to frustrate Michigan State a little bit.
Yes.
Because it's just never, you just don't feel like it's a free-flowing game. It's hard to feel that kind of energy playing against them. So instead, it becomes sort of a grit toughness battle, which is funny to say about Northwestern because for forever, for my whole life, up until even when they had good teams like during the Bill Carmody era and they were competitive, they were just not tough. They were not physical. It's the one thing that Chris Collins has done better than I think anything else, and he's done a lot of good things there, is to change the perception of Northwestern basketball. You now know going in, well, those guys are going to make it hard on you. They're going to be there's a soccer term that gets used all the time, hard to play against. And that's what Northwestern is. they're hard to play against because they've got enough guys with some physicality. They can bang you. They're also out there, ball hawking, as we've talked about. So they put you under physical and mental pressure in that sense. And then they're going to make you defend for, 25 seconds, usually per possession. They don't take quick shots. So all of that stuff kind of combine. And if they're at home, all that stuff kind of comes together to make for an unpleasant couple of hours. So that's what Michigan State's faced with. Is it's going to be, I would be surprised if it's not a slog and a game where you just kind of got to will yourself to get a win, and it won't look pretty. But
It'll be interesting to see how Michigan State looks against this defense because, the last few years with Hogard, just the pace was much, much slower.
Yeah.
Getting into offense is slower. And now you have an attacking offense more so this year than we've seen in a number of years. I wonder if you'll have as many of the late clock, late possession shots, tossing it Walker and just having him do something. It'll be interesting to see if that's a little bit different this year.
I think you'll have more of it than we typically see with this team, but hopefully it's not going to be what we've seen in recent years for the reasons you suggested. That's what you got to hang your hat on if you're a Michigan State person. Is they're going to get into offense more quickly. The ball's going to move better. There's going to be a better pace and an energy to their half-court offense, and thus they're going to get better shots earlier. That's the hope. And I think there's a reasonably good chance that we see a lot of that. But it's just the nature of this game. When you total everything up, I just don't expect it to be easy.
Yeah, I feel like the thing I'd worry about watching this game, especially early, is to see how Michigan State is doing. Is if their first 10 shots in this game, or 7 of them are 3-pointers as well, like they were against Washington. I'd be a lot more concerned in this game. The last game, where you could argue they were like all wide open good looks and they just were missing them. But
it's really funny because for years, this gym was a place where I just have memories of guys like Mo Ager and Darrell Summers, like Michigan State wings just going off at that place. I just remember a ton of corner threes from those guys. And yeah, it's not what you want to see with this team. You're absolutely right. You don't want to see, 6 of the first 8 shots coming from 3. I don't think that's, unless they just happen to be dialed in, but you don't want to count on good fortune. I just think as a method of playing, it's not the advisable one.
Yeah.
You want to see Michigan State doing what they do best, which is getting the ball to the rim and scoring from there, drawing fouls, getting to the free throw line, maybe getting the occasional transition basket. But I say all that, and I know that Northwestern is good enough that they're going to take at least some of that away.
Yeah, they're going to want you to shoot the threes and have Carr wide open out there in the corner.
Right, and they're capable of doing it. And so, it's funny. Ken Pom has, and I don't take too much from this, but it has the predicted score 70-67. I'm going to be very pleasantly surprised to see Michigan State hit the 70s.
Yeah, I think so.
I just think that is the last thing that Chris Collins wants. Chris Collins would love to see a game played in the 50s. I mean, that game last year, I think, was 58-44, right? Is that right?
That sounds miserable enough to.
No, I'm dead wrong. It was 88-74, so it was wild.
Okay.
But the game at Breslin that Michigan State won toward the end of the year, 53-49.
Yeah, there you go.
That's much more of what I expect to see. Not necessarily quite that low, because I think Michigan State at least is a better offensive team they were a year ago, and one more prone to score more points than that. But I'm not going to be surprised if it's a game played in the 50s. I really will not be surprised if it's a game played in the 60s.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if it's in the 70s.
Well, this is a game that, Michigan State should win. It's certainly winnable, but it's we're at just having this conversation the other night.
Winnable,
Winnable,
winnable.
yeah. This for a team that has aspirations for win the Big Ten. This is a game you've got to try and pull out of the road because they're going to be plenty more difficult road wins than this one. It's the only time they play Northwestern this season, the weird sort of new Big Ten with 18 teams. So they only, this is their only opportunity to match up. And then again, I think these are the games you have to win if you want to have aspirations for something more. We were talking the last game about whether this team is real. I think we both think they are, but until we see them string together some tricky wins, like this would be a trickier place to win than I think the Ohio State game, for instance. And then get this
Yeah.
win, go home, take care of business against Penn State, and then we'll see what happens against Illinois, and then we can start making projections. And is this team really for real, or is this a team that still has a little bit more work to do?
You know what it is? Was I was looking at the schedule and everybody's talking about, including us. Well, February it really turns up, right? And it
Yeah.
does. But the road games they play are not, for the most part, terrible.
No, I
Like
mean at
they're
Michigan's
at
bad.
the at Michigan, yeah, but that's they compete in Chrysler.
Yeah, it's a tough
That's not
team. I'm just saying this
at
year. That's
at Illinois. At Illinois is the
yes,
one that stands out. But other than that, but this is my point.
yes. I know. Yeah. Okay.
I think that it's funny, but in a way, games like this one or the complete other side of the spectrum, they go to Iowa later in February. I think
Yeah.
it's February, maybe it's March. But they go on the road to Iowa for their meeting with them this year. Those are the games that worry me maybe a little bit more, certainly not more than Illinois or Michigan, because those are legitimately good teams, but say more than like an Ohio State
Right.
or, I don't know, somebody else that's more of a straight up kind of team. It's those teams that can play the kind of games, especially at home, that are a little more unusual. In Iowa's case, it's going to be, well, are you gonna end up having to just withstand a barrage of threes at
Right.
Carver Hawkeye? You might. It happens. You know. Um, with Northwestern, are they just going to be able to turn this into a sluggish, turgid kind of affair that they can kind of just gut out and win? You'd rather play maybe a team that's a bit quote unquote better, but also a little more conventional. Like I happen to think Ohio State is probably better than either Northwestern or Iowa, but I think those road games for MSU might actually be at least a little bit more challenging, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think this is look, if MSU loses, I'm not ready to declare them out of the Big Ten title race. But you are right. This is a time of the year in this schedule and a situation where you want to get this one. If you lose it, you're not out of anything, but your momentum is slowed a little bit. And I think that it definitely is one you want to get, and it's one that is there to get. They could get it. You could even say they should, but I don't think they're. I think the Ken Palm spread is right. I don't think
Yeah.
they're a massive favorite, just because of all these factors we've talked about for the last hour.
Yeah. Well, we'll be looking forward to seeing how that turns out. Of course, then returning back to Breslin on Wednesday against Penn State. So I actually am looking forward to getting back to Michigan and getting back to the Breslin Center, which is strangely I've missed the first two games, Big Ten games, both Nebraska and the Washington game. So of course, both 30 some point looks like kind of a lot of fun blowouts. So
Yeah.
well, hopefully that continues when I get back for the Wednesday's game against Penn State. But we'll be back after the Northwestern game. So until next time, the Final Four is not on the schedule. Go green.